welcome to our spring series of lectures this evening. Spring has certainly sprung here. It's almost like we went from spring into the summer with the weather here, but we'll take it. We're very pleased this evening to have a neighbor here to speak to us from the Methodist Church, not far away from us here in front of Castel Sant'Angelo. Also a colleague at the University of St. Thomas Aquinas at the Angelicum. Daniel PRATT MORRIS-CHAPMAN is the pastor of the Methodist Church here in Rome. He is also visiting professor at the Angelicum and a research fellow at Wesley House in Cambridge. He's done a lot of work, personal work, on the figure of Cardinal Newman. And so that's why when we were talking, we spoke about a challenging exchange between Newman, Thomas Aquinas, and Wesley. And so we'll see what he comes up with this evening. The very interesting part of this is the last part of his title, which is an Inductive Ecumenism. And that's where my curiosity has come, so I can't wait to hear what Daniel has come up with. So without further ado, I give you Pastor Daniel.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. I'll start with a quote from Newman, because you can't go far wrong quoting St. John Henry Newman. Wesleyanism represents an idea, a doctrine, system, and polity. No one but will connect it with the well-known divine and preacher whose name it bears. Yet when we look back upon its course during the years since it commenced, how many are the changes and vicissitudes through which the man is connected with his work? So much so that it is a most difficult task, and one which perhaps must be reserved for a later age, duly to review its history, to say what really belongs and what is foreign to it, to find a key for the whole, and a clue for the succession of its parts. The event alone, still future, will bring its completion and also its interpretation. That was Newman's essay on development before he was initiated into the Catholic fold. In recent years, Newman scholars such as Fred Aquino and the Methodist, the late William Abraham, have argued for a new subdiscipline for examining the rationality or epistemology of theology, in order to try and see what might constitute appropriate evaluation of the logic in theology. And they write, it has been commonplace in epistemology to explore in detail the logic of particular academic disciplines. The logic of science, for example, has received the lion's share of interest. But attention has also been given to mathematics, history, aesthetics, and ethics. The crucial warrant for these later developments goes back to Aristotle's insistence that we should fit our evaluations in an appropriate way to the subject matter under investigation. So the idea is that each subject has its own internal logic, and this logic can be excavated or rendered explicit. In proposing this new approach to evaluating the logic governing theological proposals, these writers cite John Henry Newman, particularly John Henry Newman's essay on the development of doctrine, where Newman frequently cites Aristotle and this Aristotelian principle that when we look at a subject, we should try and look at each subject with its own integrity in mind. So it would be foolish, Aristotle says, to expect a mathematician to write good poetry and to expect a poet to be good at maths. Exceptions exist, but Aristotle says each subject, Each discipline has its own expertise, its own logic, and we should look for that logic in each area of knowledge. And John Henry Newman does this with the history of the Catholic Church. His reference to Aristotle is significant, for he says, immediately prior to becoming a Catholic, he says he's going to evaluate the logic, internal logic of the tradition of the Catholic Church, evaluating its teaching over the centuries to see how it connects the present with the past. And John Henry Newman attempted to uncover a logic between the teaching of the early church and the Catholic doctrines upheld by his contemporaries. He felt that initially he couldn't see the two as synonymous, but then later he said that there was a connection. But this connection was as a result of analyzing that history, of trying to discern the contours of that history, as though he was a cartographer trying to discern the contours of a territory he had not been in. He tried to chart the mountains, the deserts, the lakes, everything. And so his essay on development is an attempt to understand the Catholic tradition and to connect what he saw, the differences between the early church and the present. Why do I talk about this today? Well, I believe that Newman's approach to reconciling the teaching of the early church with the teaching of the Catholic Church of his day has a utility when discussing Catholic and Methodist unity. If we look at the problems of trying to reconcile differences between our traditions, we are in fact faced with perhaps a comparable difficulty to the one John Henry Newman was trying to resolve before becoming a Catholic. His difficulty was how he could reconcile the early church with the church of his time. We perhaps, I propose, have an analogous difficulty before us. We know and believe that Jesus wants us to be one. We know in our hearts, we see Christ's presence in each other. We see the Spirit of God in each other. And our official churches officially have said, in Vatican II, it says that the separated churches and communities, though we believe them to be different in some respects, have been by no means deprived of significance and importance in the mystery of salvation, for the Spirit of Christ has not refrained from using them as a means of salvation. So that's in Vatican II. And John Wesley says in his own writings about the Catholic spirit, he says, although there is differences in opinions or modes of worship, can we not love alike, even if we think in different ways? May we be of one heart, though we are not always of one opinion. Here we see an acknowledgement on both sides of the reality of God's presence in our different walks with Christ. Despite the challenges of trying to reconcile what might be considered differences, there is something clearly there in both of us that God has put. Newman saw this. He knew that the church of the early years had God's presence, and he knew that the church of his day had God's presence. But he could see things that he couldn't reconcile. So he tried to discern the connection. He tried to join the dots between the two. Here I want to try and do the same thing. But I'm not going to try and resolve the differences between contemporary British Methodism and contemporary Catholicism. I think that would take us a long time, and some of you haven't had your dinner yet. Instead, I propose a different kind of approach. Let's look at Wesley's movement, the movement that Wesley started. Let's look at its contours. Let's look at its shape. Let's try and chart the different features of what Wesley was trying to do. And then let's see if that shape can fit within the contemporary Catholic Church. it's helpful at this juncture to isolate what might be considered the essential features of the Methodism initiated by John Wesley. As John Henry Newman said, what really belongs to it and what is foreign to it. To do this, we must go back to the beginning. Wesley himself states that the seeds of Methodism were sown in Oxford, Georgia, and London. It is to these seeds of Methodism, identified by Wesley himself, that we now turn. Let's begin with Oxford. Oxford was not the Oxford of today, where you pay lots of money to go. You probably paid lots of money, but it wasn't quite as good quality as it is today. Some of the lecturers didn't turn up. Some of them were drunk during lectures, and it wasn't quite what we imagine Oxford to be today. And John Wesley and his brother and others around them decided that they must seek to be holy in the midst of what might be described in Italian as a casino. This led them to begin to live a holy life despite their surroundings. And John started to examine himself and to really examine everything about himself, examining how he thought, how his motivations were, using Thomas à Kempis as a guide and other sources. He really put himself in front of the spiritual mirror and gave himself a good going over. Extracts from his journal are terrifying because he really put himself through it. He even analyzed every inch of his time. If he played cards, he really gave himself a good hiding. And not literally, but he really put himself through it. He really examined everything about himself, every millimeter. And he was inspired by many Catholic sources in doing this, in trying to seek a holy life, to be holy not just on the external, but inwardly holy. And in this, he was inspired by Thomas à Kempis. And they started a group that was called the Holy Club. And they gathered around them others where they prayed together, they woke early, and John Wesley used to wake people up if they weren't up, so that they would pray, read the scriptures, and also not only be holy in their prayers or in their spiritual life, but going out into Oxford to prisons, teaching children who had no access to education, and really involved in very big social works to try and live holy lives in the world. This zealous attempt brought them all kinds of appellations, which we won't go into here because I think it wouldn't be polite. But they were also called Methodists because they were so methodical in their devotional lives and in their use of time. No time was to be wasted. Everything was to be approached in a methodical way, planned and organized. And this led to people calling them Methodists. But John decided that really Oxford wasn't the place to achieve this kind of thing. And he convinced himself, reading French Romantic writers, that if he went to the back of beyond and lived with people who had not been exposed to the corruption of civilization, he might be able to convince them to live this holy life, inspired very much by the early Christian writings. I said he was inspired by Thomas à Kempis, but he was also very much interested in the apostolic constitutions and was trying to apply very ancient Christian devotional practices, fastings, and other kinds of prayers. He wanted to implement them in Oxford, but he felt, no, these Oxford people, they'll never accept this. So I'll go to the back of beyond. And America then was the back of beyond. I'm talking before Hollywood, before McDonald's, before even Kentucky Fried Chicken. John Wesley went there when none of these things were there. And he tried to inflict upon his parishioners everything the early church could warrant. And they did not like him. They called him Catholic. And he insisted that they should take the Eucharist every week. In those days, people might take Holy Communion 4 times a year in the Church of England. But John Wesley insisted that his parishioners in Savannah, Georgia, take it every week, confess their sins to him before attending the Eucharist, encourage them to fast regularly in accordance with the practices of the early church, meeting in small groups for prayer, exhortation, mutual accountability and instruction, allowing lay people to lead these small groups and allowing deaconesses to lead. This he found in the early church, in the apostolic constitutions, and he intended to copy and paste it into Georgia. I'd love to tell you it worked out well, but I'd be a liar. They threw him out as quickly as you can throw out something you don't like to eat. So he tried to copy and paste the early church's teachings in Georgia, and it didn't work. But what's interesting is that although at that stage he simply saw what was happening in the early church and tried to recreate it without contextualizing it or adapting it to the present, he was firmly rooted in what he believed to be primitive or apostolical Christianity, and that was his vision. He returned to London with what might be called a midlife crisis. He couldn't buy a Ferrari as the beauty of these things had not yet been created. But he came back to the UK asking himself serious questions, serious spiritual questions. And it was at this point that he had a profound spiritual experience, which many Christians in many traditions describe perhaps as an assurance of the presence of God's Spirit in one's heart. But while some scholars say that Wesley then became a different kind of Christian from the one he was before, one can see between the surface of the new things that Wesley tried to do in Britain the same apostolical practices. For example, instead of having vigils, he had watch nights. Instead of agape meals, he had love feasts. Instead of catechumens, he had classes and bands. One can see Wesley attempting to contextualize early Christian practices into forms that he thought might be pertinent in the context he now found himself in Britain. He started preaching outside. He started preaching to people on the periphery of society. And although what might be called evangelical Christianity seems to be the paradigm in which he now operated, a deeper look at Wesley's behaviors see the same apostolical principles guiding his ministry. However, we must be clear that Wesley did not intend to do something separate from the Church of England. He wanted to create a movement for scriptural holiness, a movement within the church that would lead to people's lives being transformed, lead to renewal within the church and within the nation. This is confirmed by his refusal to allow lay people to preside at the Eucharist, and his insistence that Methodist meetings should not take place on Sundays, when he encouraged all and sundry to go to the local Anglican parish churches. Wesley was trying to do something that he understood to be extraordinary. He felt he had an extraordinary apostolic calling to evangelize the British Isles, to start a movement among all kinds of ordinary people, that they could use their gifts, ordinary lay people, could be energized to live holy lives, to preach and witness their faith to others, and to seek complete sanctification in this life. He was not a schismatic, but he did take extraordinary measures to ensure that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness could be filled. While this at times brought him into tension with the Church of England, he concluded that he must be faithful to his extraordinary calling, as he so believed it was. He writes, "What is the end of all ecclesiastical order? Is it not to bring souls from the power of Satan to God, and to build them up in his fear and love? Order, then, is so far valuable as it answers these questions, and if it answers them not, it is worth nothing." Here we gain an insight into Wesley's inductive approach, whereby the missionary imperative is paramount. Though this may appear to be at odds with perhaps the tradition from which he came, or the tradition, I think, of the wider Christian church, Lumen Gentium reminds us that the Catholic Church strives constantly and with due effect to bring all humanity and all its possessions back to its source in Christ, with him as its head and united in his Spirit. Integrating Wesley's vision into the Catholic Church of today. In the above, we have identified what might be considered essential components of Wesley's discipleship movement shaped for mission. To summarize, it entails scriptural holiness, inward and outward, lay people intimately involved in the preaching of the gospel, in discipleship, in supervision of small groups, and these, although under Wesley's supervision, being integral to the witness of the church, and the central place of extempore prayer and extempore preaching. These were absolutely integral to early Methodism. Having identified some of the essential features of Wesley's historical movement, I just want to explore whether or not a movement like that could be coherently incorporated within the Catholic Church of today. There is no need here to discuss the universal call to holiness, which has been affirmed by both our traditions in the dialogue, the Methodist Catholic dialogue. If I read here, Catholics affirm the universal call to holiness in the church. Since Christ is holy in the church, everyone, whether belonging to the hierarchy or cared for by it, is called to holiness. That's Lumen Gentium. The call to holiness similarly lies at the heart of Methodism, whose providential mission has been to reform nations, particularly the church, and to spread scriptural holiness over the land. That's the Houston report. Indeed, John Wesley's understanding of the central place of holiness is shaped considerably by Catholic sources, Thomas à Kempis, and indeed the apostolical traditions he was so inspired by. However, I think it's helpful here to explore whether the central role given to lay preaching, which is absolutely pivotal in Methodism, can lay preaching cohere with the teaching of the Catholic Church today? Well, I had a conversation with a Jesuit the other day, which Newman tended to do when he was in Rome, and I enjoy doing it myself. And he said that Sant'Angelo used to tell people who were wanting to join the Jesuits that they ought to go and preach in the piazzas. So this was before they were ordained, and apparently their Italian wasn't very good, many of them being not Italians. So there's an example, but let's look at something a bit more concrete for today. Jordan Hammond, the Methodist scholar, maintains that Wesley's ministry in an American context, not so dissimilar to the context which inspired the Amazon Synod. Because if you think about it, when Wesley went to America, he was in a context, a missionary context, not that dissimilar to the challenges faced in the Amazon today. I'm not talking about America today. Let me just underline that. I'm not talking about contemporary America in the US, but when John Wesley was in the US as it is now, it was not what it is now, and there are parallels, perhaps, in these missionary situations. Indeed, the special circumstances in which the church finds herself in the Amazon today have provoked important reflections about the nature of the church's ministry. And I'm quoting now from the Amazon Synod. In the specific circumstances of the Amazon region, particularly in its forests and more remote places, a way must be found to ensure this priestly ministry. The laity can proclaim God's word, teach, organize communities, celebrate certain sacraments, seek different ways to express popular devotion, and develop the multitude of gifts that the Spirit pours out in their midst. But they need the celebration of the Eucharist because it makes the church. We can even say that no Christian community is built up which does not grow from and hinge on the celebration of the Eucharist. So there's a challenge there, but there's also an opportunity. And here we see the church wrestling with questions not so dissimilar to the challenges facing John Wesley when he traversed the British Isles, planting communities or creating small groups who would pray together. He wanted them to have communion, and he didn't want the lay people to do that, so he allowed them to do practically everything else apart from that. And he tried to encourage them to go to the local Anglican church. An extraordinary revival compelled John Wesley to step outside the ecclesiological contours of the Anglican tradition in order to explore new ways of fostering ministry. In a similar way, the Amazon Synod affirmed that the Church's ministry in the Amazon requires the development of a distinctly lay ecclesial culture in order for the Amazon peoples to receive both God's word and growth in holiness. This is not for a moment intended to diminish the three orders of ministry: bishop, priests, and deacons. To his day, Wesley upheld the teaching that only ordained priests should preside at the Eucharist. So too the Church today upholds the necessity of ordained ministry. Nevertheless, Wesley equipped lay people to carry out the evangelistic mission to which he believed God had called his people. So the Amazon Synod reminded the Church that priests are necessary, but this does not mean that permanent deacons, of whom there should be many more in the Amazon region, religious women and lay persons, cannot regularly assume important responsibilities for the growth of communities and perform those functions ever more effectively with the aid of suitable accompaniment. Consequently, it is not simply a question of facilitating a greater presence of ordained ministers who can celebrate the Eucharist. That would be a very narrow aim. From the above, it is clear that under extraordinary circumstances, responsibilities can be entrusted to deacons and lay people to undertake important pastoral responsibilities. And Wesley really was trying to do the same thing. He was trying, under extraordinary circumstances, to ensure that discipleship and growth in holiness occurred. But this is not necessarily to say these should only be considered in emergency situations. It is indeed a fundamental part of Methodism. And the Catholic Church is clear on the same point. The whole Church is missionary, and the work of evangelism is the duty of the whole people of God. All Christians have a responsibility for spreading the gospel and may do their share in missionary work among the nations. Lay people are called to announce Christ, to explain and spread his teaching, that the innumerable opportunities should be given to the laity for the exercise of their apostolate, evangelization, and sanctification. I'm quoting here official Catholic statements. But what about the place of extempore prayer? Well, this one, of course, poses some challenges because in the Mass there is a set text that must be used. But there are circumstances within the week. We're not talking about Sundays now. In the week, it is perfectly possible for Christians in the Catholic tradition to meet together, to pray together, to be involved in small groups. This is perfectly possible. And this is something that is encouraged according to appropriate supervision. And that's exactly what John Wesley was seeking to do. And although in the Mass there is the set prayers, there is space in certain situations for special celebrations of the Mass with children and young people, allow space for spontaneous prayers. So there is room here as well, and I think there is possibility for development. But finally, what would we call such a movement within the Methodist Church? What would we call it? Well, I don't know. If the Methodists were to be fully, organically united, Methodists like Wesley's, I'm not talking about Methodist churches, I'm just saying if something like John Wesley's missionary movement of his time existed now, how would you integrate it into the Catholic Church of today? Well, there are societies of associations of the Christian faithful, or societies of the Christian faithful. And Wesley indeed called Methodism societies. He didn't call them churches, he called them societies. And within the Catholic teaching of today, there is space within canon law for associations or societies of the Christian faithful, which would allow for organizations like the one I have described to be integrated. Don't misunderstand me. There are doctrinal issues to be dealt with, but as I said, you don't want to miss your dinner. And I don't pretend to have answers to all the doctrinal questions that may need to be ironed out. But Wesley's actual movement was not contrary to Anglican teaching in the 18th century. And I believe from the Anglican-Catholic dialogue, huge strides have been made in trying to understand how doctrinally questions can be resolved. So I do not believe such questions are beyond resolution. And I do think that the dialogues between the Anglican and the Catholic and the Methodist and the Catholic are doing a wonderful job. I know there are other obstacles to overcome, and I don't pretend to have the answer to them. I'm only 40, but I do believe that I see the Spirit of Christ in the movement that John Wesley started, and I do see the same Spirit in my Catholic brothers and sisters today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this stimulating and dynamic presentation this evening. I'm sure this will provoke some questions from our followers online and some questions from our people here in presence. I would just like to make one observation as you were speaking, thinking again about the historical dimensions that you brought out. Pier Valdo began a lay movement which was not accepted by the church, but 100 years later, Francis of Assisi did pretty much the exact same thing with the lay preachers, etc. So this pattern, I think you could say that Wesley was breaking ground, new ground, both for the Anglican tradition and also for the Catholic tradition, because he was talking about renewing those traditions. And of course, the Catholic Church had to wait a few hundred years before the Vatican II took over. But with Methodists, I think we can say that we share a deep spirituality that is not foreign to either one of us. So I thank you very much for bringing those points out. The inductive ecumenism, now we're going to get to that, okay. I can understand where you want to go with that, but how would you see this getting played out in reality?
Well, of course, I avoided that question because it's highly, highly charged in the sense that I think I said to you, Jim, before the start, when you look at the plethora of Methodist traditions today, galloping in all kinds of directions, I think some Methodists are saying, well, what is it? They're asking the question John Henry Newman asked, what is it that is essential to our charisms? What's our DNA and what isn't? And I think there's a lot of discussions going on within the Methodist traditions globally, and I think there are questions to what our identity is up for debate. And I think practically there may be groups asking, what did Wesley want to achieve, and how do we keep faithful to that? That's a question a lot of Methodists are asking in all kinds of different manifestations, and I think different traditions would have different answers. But I can say individually, I think going back to the source can give you inspiration. And I think, as you've said, there are many parallels between movements like this in the Christian histories. So I fudged that one, I think.
So we have other people here that might want to raise some questions.
So I'm Philippa Hitchin. I worked in the Vatican for many years, and I'm currently working with the Lutheran World Federation. And thank you so much for this really, really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. You're talking about the plethora of Methodist movements. There's also been, since Vatican II, as you know, a plethora of lay Catholic movements that have been founded, many of them looking back, as you say, to the early church, trying to recreate in some way the same kind of conditions to encourage new ways of thinking and new ways of looking at issues in the Catholic Church. I'm wondering if you kind of see any particular connections or interest in any of these movements within the Catholic Church that might be connecting to what you're trying to suggest today.
I think what has been an enormous blessing and privilege being in Rome has been, coming from Colville in the middle of England, which I won't labor about. To meet some of these wonderful groups, Focolare, for example, has been an enormous privilege to be connected, to see the work that they do, and I think there's enormous resonances between these things, and I think it's a privilege to be in Rome, and I think there's so much scope for looking at similarities between some of these groups and how we can be more united and walk together more closely. So I would say it's been enormous privilege to be in Rome and to see, coming from Colville. Nothing wrong with Colville, by the way, if anyone's watching from Colville. But yeah.
I'm Matthew Lafferty from the Methodist Ecumenical Office, and I get to share the same floor in our building with Daniel. I'm reflecting on how you really draw out holiness, which of course is an important Methodist theological point. It's also been one of the most fruitful aspects of our Methodist Catholic dialogue, and so you draw in your lecture from that as well. Thinking about it within the framework of mission, Methodists and Catholics in this dialogue have committed to unity and faith, sacrament, and then the third point is mission.
Yeah.
And I hear you drawing out the role of laity as being one of those points about a missional church, to put into my language. What might be other places you can see Methodist Catholics having dialogue, thinking about the mission of the church being a missionary church, for future dialogue, one for renewal within our own traditions, or points of contention about how we think about being missional in our world now?
Well, I think there's enormous scope for this, and I didn't apply for your job because I didn't have an answer to that question. But there's enormous scope for this. Enormous scope for this, and I think yes. I don't know where to begin because I think there's enormous scope for this. I think there's so many things. I think the holiness thing, you're absolutely right, and that's why I didn't need to say much about that, because is clearly, obviously, the same vision to be holy as Jesus is holy, as God is holy, and I think that focus on Holiness is obviously there. I think evangelism, there's huge scope for movements that encourage the gifts of, this is the beauty of Methodism, the empowering of the lay people, and I see this in Focolare, and I see this in other, and I think energizing, because I think the church will grow globally, and churches grow globally when lay people are energized with holiness, with discipleship. In Cameroon, where we used to work, the lay people were so involved in so many things, and I think this is pivotal. And I think anywhere where we can see that, and I think Focolare is a wonderful example. I don't work for Focolare; I'm not on their payroll or anything. I think that's a brilliant example of this. But there are so many. There's so many possibilities, which is a rich possibilities there. Yes.
I set you up because this is one of the questions the Dialogue Commission is asking, because we've developed quite significantly our work in 55 years on sacrament and faith, but looking at this aspect of mission, which also seems to be a time to ask these questions with the new constitution that was promulgated by Pope Francis recently, and thinking about how we're reorienting ourselves to being missional.
Yeah.
There is a question from the online platform. Which is the place of the Eucharist in Newman's and in Wesley's writings, and how is the practice nowadays? Has this something to do with the searching of the sanctity? It's from Pablo Blanco, the University of Navarra in Spain.
Okay. Well, St. John Henry Newman would have upheld a Catholic position on this. So St. John Henry Newman would have held a Catholic position. The hymns of John and Charles Wesley, particularly Charles Wesley, are spectacular. When our British General Secretary of the British Methodist Church came to meet Pope Francis, he gave a copy of the Eucharistic hymns of John and Charles Wesley to Pope Francis, and I think it's a very clear that the Wesleys had a very, very high and precious view of the Eucharist, and although it wouldn't conform precisely with the Catholic tradition, these hymns are so. If you sing these hymns, you can't but see the enormous, almost reverence that they had, both of them, for the Eucharist. And I think John Wesley communicated daily, and their view of the Eucharist was absolutely. I mean, it's ironic that the reason we have communion in Methodist churches today once a month in Britain is because John Wesley wouldn't let lay people give it out, and he wasn't always in the same place, so thus lay people couldn't do it, so we have it once a month. But bizarre, he absolutely thought it was pivotal. So yes, I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's a good question. So, well done. Yes. They're getting more difficult.
There is another question from the online platform from Professor Gillian Kingston, Ireland. You talked about John Wesley's contextualizing early Christian practices to 18th century Britain. How should Methodists and Catholics attempt this in the world of the 21st century?
Well, one of my teachers at college wrote, the Reverend Dr. Peter Phillips, he wrote about the digital parish. And I'm about as digital as somebody who isn't very digital. I'm analog. And when the COVID happened, I was very suspicious and skeptical about all this Facebook business. And I think the first time I did a Facebook service, I pressed record, and then it went off, but I carried on doing the service on my own, with Jesus, of course, until an hour later, not realizing that nobody else was able to see because the phone battery had gone. So I think that I was challenged that we serve the present age and we serve a digital age, and although personally, I find it very uncomfortable and difficult. John Wesley also found it very difficult to go into the fields and preach. He said he became vile. And I must confess, I felt quite uncomfortable doing all the Facebook services when the COVID happened. But I've realized it's so important that we do witness in the digital age that we're in. And I think there's real questions about what it means and how we retain our integrity. But I think that's something certainly. But also how to remember that the world hasn't all got internet and the world hasn't all got power or electricity. So there's some places where these things are absolutely pivotal. There's other places where there's no electricity, there's no internet, and we mustn't sort of allow ourselves to be focused on one side of the coin when there's so many people who don't have access to all of this. So it depends where you are, I think, in the world, I think.
You had talked about the questions of the doctrinal difficulties. And I think Pope Francis has said in his approach to ecumenism that the theologians must work these out, but we, the baptized, must live the realities. So there's not really, I don't see an opposition between these two, because the fact that we can relate to one another, hopefully in a very prayerful way, in a very honest and authentic way, and I think that's what Pope Francis says, because we have been afraid of the other because we are ignorant of the other, and therefore we're closed, we're boxed in. Father Congar said at the time of the Second Vatican Council, what was going on in this room showed how ignorant we were of each other, and that this was the beginning of breaking down those walls so that we could meet each other as members of Christ's body, recognizing each other. So I don't see a major problem here. They have to go on at the same level, and I think a lot of the doctrinal issues are resolved actually from the practice of the faithful. So this might be part of your inductive path forward, to look at that. And then just one other thing, we were talking before about beginning programs for the young people again, and there you said that you did this online, and you found them very much enthused and very much active of this. They're more active there than they are coming to church on Sunday. But there you have, again, another way of reaching out to those that ordinarily we might not get in touch with.
I think you're right. I mean, the online work where possible, where it doesn't compromise our, I think it's brilliant. I think the doctrinal things, I might be wrong about this, but the Anglicans and the Catholics sorted out a lot of things, if I'm not mistaken, in the dialogue doctrinally. And John Wesley's movement, I think, because my question is, could a movement like that be integrated into full organic unity with the Catholic Church today as a formally integral part? I think, as you say, there's not that many things that would prevent an enormous difficulty. The doctrine of justification, there's so many things that, have been really. So I think if the question was, could an organization like the one John Wesley was involved with be integrated fully organically into the Catholic Church today, I think there might not be that many things to sort out, but I might be wrong about that. Yes, because he died as an Anglican, so doctrinally he was pretty much an Anglican. Yeah.
You mentioned the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, and as you, I'm sure, know, there's a sort of a new revival, if you like. Since the Methodists and the Anglicans and the Reformed churches have all joined that original Lutheran Catholic statement, revolutionary statement in its own way. There is now this 5-partner platform attempting to move forward on many of these questions, and yet I was at a meeting, well, it was before COVID, and of course we've had the pandemic, and that's caused a lot of slowing down of the momentum, perhaps, of these things. But there doesn't seem to me to be a lot happening in what could be an incredibly fruitful ecumenical adventure. What would your message be to these people who are working at the coalface there of that JDDJ platform, as they call it?
Well, obviously, I wouldn't feel presumed to tell them anything, but I think you're right. It's very important work. I think the doctrinal discussions must be of paramount importance, and we should never think them. I think they are absolutely pivotal. So in taking the approach I've taken, I would still absolutely say these things must be given absolute priority. But as Father Jim has said, we mustn't pause doing everything we can together while it's almost like both and. But those discussions are absolutely integral to full organic unity, and I think we must never ever let them become a side thing, while equally emphasizing the importance of doing things and walking together and being involved together as much as we can.
Maybe I could just make one other observation in the question. Going back to the doctrinal issues, the dogmatic issues, it seems that the problem lies maybe on both sides here, because from the Catholic side we said we want to hear you say the way we say what you believe that the Eucharist is, for example. Then we could say that we're in 100% agreement. But we know that those words would not be authentic. And so therefore, we need to find a new language. We need to find a new way of using concepts that do not any longer articulate the fullness of the truth that we confess on both sides to believe in. In 2024, we have the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And it's my idea that we should not just have a historical commemoration of what that council was, but have a serious epistemological study of the concepts that were used to express the realities that the early Christians said was the essentials of their faith that no longer speak to anyone today. For example, the English translation of the Creed, consubstantial, is used. It's a word that no one uses in daily speech, and would never understand the technical dimensions of it. So we need to find new words, new concepts that do express the mystery of the faith that we believe in, so that the next generation can also grow in that, and not just by saying the formula that was passed on. Because Paul said, what I have received, I've handed on to you. It was not a formula, it was a reality. And so this, could this be part again of your program of inductive ecumenism, to look at how we can deal with those issues together? Because we live in the same world. Methodists are challenged like Catholics are challenged with the same questions, anthropological questions, human sexuality, freedom, identity, etc. And we struggle to find words and concepts to say what we have come to understand about those realities.
I think the late William Abraham, a Methodist theologian, he is profoundly influenced. He was profoundly influenced by John Henry Newman. And he proposes the same kind of thing, an epistemological discipline within theology focused on these questions. And I think that he is using this idea from which Newman uses, from Aristotle of how do you look for the logical coherence within the tradition and move historically forward, which Bernard Lonergan also does, historical consciousness. How do we today authentically witness conceptually to these truths? And this book, which is by me, so I asked Jim to do this because this is awful, really. This is scandalous. I wrote this book about John Henry Newman, but it's really about William Abraham, the Methodist scholar as well, and how philosophically we need to do exactly what Jim has just said. And I think ecumenically, I think it would be a missed opportunity if all of the Christians were involved in such a statement, and then it would really be a very valuable piece of work, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate your reference to Aristotle, but Aristotle is the one that got us into a lot of problems in the late Middle Ages. And my plea would be to use the sacramental epistemological logic, because there we're dealing with the question of mystery, and there we are humbled, saying that we cannot grasp the fullness of this by ourselves, and that's why we need each other. So if we do what Aristotle did in terms of dissecting everything on every level, but then for somehow or other not putting it back together within the context of humanity, then we might have the same problem replicated again.
But in the Nicomachean Ethics, he has different methodologies for different things. And in his Ethics, he says, don't use the hammer on the window, and which is what you're rightly saying. So I think it just depends which bit of Aristotle. You can copy and paste the wrong bit of Aristotle, and I think you're absolutely right. That has been done to death. But what Aristotle really says, and what Newman, and this is why Newman has struggled to become a doctor of the church, because the bits of Aristotle that Aquinas used are not the bits of Aristotle that Newman used. And so there's this idea that Newman and Aristotle and Newman and Aquinas have a different epistemological orientation. But actually, I think if you center on the way Newman approaches these things, he does exactly what you said. He looks at the integrity of things, not in a dissecting way, but he says, don't treat poetry like algebra. It won't work. And don't treat the tradition of the church like evidentialist epistemologists like John Locke treat faith. So, in fact, I agree with you, but I think they're using the wrong bits of Aristotle. And I think the right bits are the ones John Henry Newman uses. And I'm biased. You can read it all in this book here. Scandalous, scandalous.
Thank you for introducing us into a very extensive and deep journey that I think gives us a pause to stop and reflect on. Thank you all for your presence online and, of course, here. And thank you, Daniel, for the work that you put into this. And we look forward to being able to read it in our bulletin in the near future. So once again, thank you and have a good evening to everyone.